June 1768 was the month that the colonial crisis became a full-blown emergency. Everything that had been building since January, the circular letter, Hillsborough's threats, the non-importation campaigns, the Regulators' march on Hillsborough, the Romney in the harbor, the customs commissioners itching to make an example of John Hancock, all of it came crashing together in a single month. A ship was seized. A riot broke out. The Crown's revenue officers fled the city of Boston for their lives. The Massachusetts legislature chose defiance over submission, 92-17, and was promptly dissolved. And the Boston Sons of Liberty wrote a letter to a British dissident in prison, calling him the illustrious martyr of liberty and asking for his help. By the end of June 1768, British authority in Massachusetts had effectively collapsed. What remained to be seen was how London would respond. The afternoon of June 10th, 1768 began as a customs enforcement action and ended as a citywide riot that sent the Crown's revenue officers fleeing for their lives. Late in the afternoon of June 10th, the collector of customs for the port of Boston walked down to Hancock's Wharf to seize a ship. Joseph Harrison was 59 years old, Yorkshire-born, and barely well enough to leave his house. But he also had a job to do. Before heading out, Harrison sent word to HMS Romney, a 50-gun British warship anchored in the harbor. If problems arose, he wanted support, and he asked the ship's captain to have armed boats standing by. Harrison and his colleague, Comptroller Benjamin Hallowell, arrived at the wharf. Hallowell's insistence on accompanying Harrison would prove unwise. Harrison's 18-year-old son had joined them, a decision that he would soon regret. The target was the Liberty, Hancock's sloop. The official pretext was a revised affidavit from customs official Thomas Kirk, who now claimed that he had been forcibly held below decks the previous month while Hancock's crew unloaded undeclared cargo. The customs officials in Boston had a long-standing grudge against Hancock, a prosperous merchant who displayed open contempt toward them, but whose careful observance of the laws gave them no opportunity to prosecute him. As Harrison moved to claim the ship, something unexpected happened. Armed boats arrived from the Romney, each full of armed sailors and Marines, and that changed everything. A crowd had already gathered. When the colony saw Royal Navy Marines boarding a merchant vessel to help seize it, hard on the heels of weeks of impressment by the same ship, they erupted. The crowd pelted us severely with stones, recalled Midshipman William Senhouse in a later account of his actions that day. But the sailors pushed on, ejecting the mob, cutting the Liberty's lines, and towing it under the imposing guns of the Romney. The crowd did not disperse. It got larger and angrier. The crowd then marched through the town streets in an attempt to find the customs agents. Not seeing them, they went to their houses and smashed a few windows. This not being satisfactory as a punishment, the crowd returned to the harbor and removed the small sailboat that belonged to Harrison from the water, dragging it through the streets to the Liberty Tree. The boat was condemned and burned to ashes on Boston Common. That image, a crowd dragging a customs official's boat through the streets and conducting a mock vice admiralty court before burning it, captures the fury of the moment perfectly. The colonists were performing, in their own way, exactly what the vice admiralty courts had done to their ships and trade, confiscating British property, condemning it, destroying it. It was theater, it was rage, and it was absolutely deliberate. The commissioners judged the city unsafe in the wake of the riot, and they fled. First to the Romney, and later to Castle William, an island fortress in Boston Harbor. They remained there for months. Castle William was a fortified island in the middle of the harbor. The customs commissioners, who had arrived the previous year with royal authority and the full power of the Townshend Acts behind them, were now effectively prisoners on an island, unable to do their job, unable to return to the city, completely dependent on the Royal Navy for protection. From Castle William, the commissioners reported to London that the province was in a state of insurrection. Governor Francis Bernard watched June 10th from Province House with a mixture of alarm and something approaching vindication. He had been writing to London for months, warning that things in Boston were spinning out of control. Now he had the riot to prove it. But Bernard faced an impossible position. He wanted troops. He needed troops. When he asked the council's advice about whether to apply for troops, they would not advise it, and he would not apply without their support. Bernard was simultaneously desperate for military reinforcement and unwilling to make himself the man who formally requested the British Army occupy a colonial city. Bernard wanted to call out troops to prevent any further rioting, but when he presented his demand to the council, they disagreed. They were quite sure that since the commissioners had left town, no further disturbances would occur. The council's position was politically convenient. With the commissioners on an island, the immediate crisis was technically resolved. No one was being beaten on the streets. The flames on Boston Common had gone out. If Bernard called for troops now, he would be the aggressor. He would be the man who had brought a military occupation down on Boston. Bernard threaded the needle as best he could. He wrote to London detailing the riot in alarming terms, portraying it as evidence of near insurrection, while carefully leaving the formal request for soldiers to his superiors. Governor Francis Bernard also sent a detailed narrative of the Liberty Affair to Lord Hillsborough, urging him to do something to help prevent an uprising because he, like the customs commissioners, believed the Americans were capable of insurrection. The troops were coming. Bernard knew it. London would order it. He just wanted to make sure that London ordered it, not him. 4 days after the riot, something remarkable happened. On June 14th, a town meeting was called at Faneuil Hall to protest the impressment of New England sailors into British naval service and the seizure of John Hancock's sloop Liberty for violation of customs laws. So many people came to Faneuil Hall that the meeting was moved to Old South Meeting House. Old South Meeting House could hold roughly 6,000 people. Faneuil Hall, Boston's official town meeting space, held fewer than 1,500. The crowd that showed up on June 14th was unprecedented. The petition that emerged from this meeting was framed in the confrontational language of radical Whigs. The exasperation that the Assembly's petition to the king had been ignored doubtless encouraged the meeting to condemn unpopular imperial laws and taxes that together seemed to threaten their destruction. The meeting produced a formal petition to Governor Bernard. Stop the impressment. Remove the Romney. Return authority to the elected representatives of the people. The very first overflow event at Old South was a speech by James Otis Jr. on June 21st, where he denounced the British Parliament's attempts to tax the colonies and the use of writs of assistance by Boston customs officials. Otis was at his incandescent best in June. He was eloquent, furious, and absolutely uncompromising. Where Adams operated through organization and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, Otis performed in the open. His speeches drawing thousands, his arguments ringing through the largest meeting house in Boston. The two men complemented each other perfectly. Adams built the machine. Otis fired it up. Bernard's response to the June 14th petition was polite, non-committal, and essentially useless. He said that he would speak to Captain Corner about the impressment. He did. Corner said he would be more careful. He wasn't particularly. The Romney stayed. The commissioners stayed on their island. And Boston stayed furious. Back in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the defining vote of the colonial resistance was approaching. Governor Bernard had delivered Hillsborough's demand to the House: rescind the Massachusetts Circular Letter or face dissolution. The sessions that followed were described by Bernard himself as led by the most violent heads of the faction, meaning Samuel Adams, James Otis, John Hancock, and their allies. On June 3rd, The legislature voted 92 to 17 against rescinding the letter. Bernard responded by suspending the legislature the very next day. Those numbers immediately became symbols. The 92 who refused, the glorious 92, became heroes throughout the colonies. The 17 who voted to rescind were publicly vilified. These rescinders were physically intimidated by the Sons of Liberty, and 5 lost their seats in the election of May 1769. The vote was not simply a legislative action. It was a public declaration, broadcast through every colonial newspaper and reprinted in Britain. When the Massachusetts House refused a direct order from the king, backed by the threat of dissolution, and accepted dissolution rather than backing down, they were saying something that had never been said quite so clearly before. We will not comply, whatever the consequences. Paul Revere later fashioned a silver bowl from 45 ounces of silver, engraved, "To the memory of the glorious 92, members of the Honorable House of Representatives of the Massachusetts Bay, who, undaunted by the insolent menaces of villains in power, from a strict regard to conscience and the liberties of their constituents, on the 30th of June 1768, voted not to rescind." The bowl became one of the iconic objects of the pre-revolutionary period. It was a piece of silversmithing. It was also propaganda, a monument, and a rallying point, all at once. Around June 28th, the House sent a petition to King George III asking for Governor Bernard to be recalled and replaced. The petition accused Bernard of lying to the king about the purpose of the circular letter. Asking the king to remove his own governor was a dramatic escalation. It was both a constitutional argument — Bernard had misrepresented the colonists' intentions to London — and a direct challenge to royal appointments. Massachusetts was telling the king, "Your man is here lying to you, and we want him gone." Bernard, naturally, did not forward this petition to London with particular enthusiasm. On June 10th, the same day that the Liberty Riot broke out in Boston, Connecticut voted to support the Massachusetts position. Before Hillsborough's letter had arrived ordering them not to, Virginia on April 14th, New Jersey on May 6th, and Connecticut on June 10th had already voted to support the Massachusetts circular letter. Connecticut's endorsement meant that 3 major colonial assemblies had formally committed to the Massachusetts position before they even received Hillsborough's threat. They weren't defying the threat. They couldn't have known about it yet. They were acting on genuine constitutional conviction. The Connecticut Assembly, led by Speaker Zebulon West, approved the Massachusetts circular letter in June. Connecticut was a steady, commercial colony, not a hotbed of radical agitation like Massachusetts. Its endorsement broadened the resistance from a New England cause to a genuinely intercolonial one. Meanwhile, the assemblies that received Hillsborough's letter after already endorsing the circular letter faced a stark choice: endorse or face dissolution. One after another, they chose to endorse. The British government managed only to stiffen American resistance by its frenzied reaction to the circular letter of Massachusetts. Hillsborough reacted in horror to the circular letter, ordering the royal governors to dissolve any colonial assemblies that would dare to endorse it. But that didn't seem to matter to them. On June 6th, the Boston Sons of Liberty sent a letter to a man sitting in a prison in London. His name was John Wilkes. Wilkes was a British MP, publisher, and professional provocateur who had been prosecuted for seditious libel in 1763 for criticizing the king's speech in his newspaper, North Briton, issue number 45. He'd fled to France, returned to England in 1768, won a parliamentary election, and was now in King's Bench prison. His case had become, in Britain and the colonies, a test of whether the government could silence political opposition through legal persecution. American enthusiasm for Wilkes revived in the late spring of 1768, when news of his return to England and his election to Parliament from Middlesex reached the colonies. The Boston Gazette of May 30th had carried a detailed account of his reception, predicting that Wilkes would be spared further legal action. 14 days later, the Gazette's readers learned that Wilkes had, instead, been arrested and committed to King's Bench Prison in April. In early June, the Sons of Liberty of Boston wrote to John Wilkes, congratulating him on his victory in the Middlesex election, and expressed their hope that he could return to Parliament. They enclosed the full set of the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer with a note that said, "His sentiments are ours." The letter itself was extraordinary. The Boston Sons of Liberty wrote, "May you convince Great Britain and Ireland in Europe, the British colonies, islands and plantations in America, that you are one of those incorruptibly honest men reserved by heaven to bless and perhaps save a tottering empire." Wilkes and liberty had become a rallying cry on both sides of the Atlantic. The phrase became a byword and frequent toast for radicals from Boston to Charleston, just as his name became anathema to moderates representing the rule of mob rather than the rule of law. The significance of this transatlantic correspondence cannot be overstated. The Boston Sons of Liberty were not just fighting a local political battle. They were consciously situating themselves within a global struggle for constitutional liberty, one that had British allies, British symbols, and British precedents. John Wilkes was the proof that Parliament's tyranny wasn't something unique to the colonies. It was happening in Britain too. And if it was happening in Britain, then the colonists weren't rebels against the crown. They were defenders of the ancient liberties of all British subjects. While Boston exploded in riot, North Carolina's backcountry crisis moved toward a more tentative negotiation, though not a resolution. As June arrived, Regulators James Hunter and Redknapp Howell came to the governor with petitions on June 20th. Governor Tryon had decided it was time to head to Hillsborough himself and get a better handle on the situation. The petition that Howell and Hunter carried bore hundreds of signatures, a massive document representing the backcountry's formal grievances against corrupt local officials, excessive fees, and tax collection practices that they considered to be illegal. It was everything the movement had been demanding for years, now organized, documented, and presented to the governor by name. Tryon's willingness to go to Hillsborough himself was significant. He recognized that the regulator movement was too large to simply suppress. The militia's reluctance to serve against their neighbors had made that clear back in May. Some negotiation was going to be necessary. But the governor was also getting pressured from two directions. The regulators wanted accountability for Fanning and other corrupt officials. Fanning and his allies wanted the regulators declared criminals and crushed. Tryon was trying to find a middle path that simply did not exist. Tryon had no alternative but to listen to the regulators' petition, and upon agreeing to do so, the regulators dispersed. With the threat somewhat diminished, Tryon got his back up and informed the regulators that their concerns were unwarranted and that their actions tended to the subversion of the constitution of the government. That response, pretending to listen and then dismissing the substance of what he had heard, set the stage for the movement's eventual return to violence. The regulators had petitioned. They had been received. They had been told, essentially, that their grievances weren't legitimate. The next time they decided on direct action, it would be harder. Look at the full picture of June 1768, and you see a colonial crisis that has crossed the threshold that it can never uncross. Before June, the resistance had been constitutional. Pamphlets, circular letters, petitions, boycotts, the tools of legal opposition within the existing system. But after June of 1768, those tools had been exhausted. The Massachusetts House had petitioned. It was dissolved. Boston's town meeting had petitioned. Governor Bernard responded with platitudes while secretly urging London to send soldiers. The customs commissioners had tried to do their jobs. They were now prisoners on an island. The non-importation movement was building. The circular letter was spreading through colonial assembly after assembly. And in London, Hillsborough was reading Bernard's reports of riot and insurrection and writing orders to General Thomas Gage. Send such force as you shall think necessary to Boston. The dissolution of the Massachusetts Assembly led to an outbreak of mob violence from colonists who no longer had any legal way to deal with their grievances. They attacked customs officials, making it impossible for them to perform their duties. In response to the deteriorating situation, Lord Hillsborough sent 4 regiments of British soldiers to Boston. The soldiers were on their way. That news hadn't reached Boston yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it would transform the crisis from a political dispute conducted through letters and meetings into something that looked unmistakably like occupation. The Liberty Affair and the mob violence that followed suggested to British parliamentarians that Boston was an unruly, even lawless place, desperately in need of a stronger military presence. This led to an increase in British troops in the city that precipitated the Boston Massacre 2 years later. The Glorious 92 had voted. The Liberty had been towed under the guns of the Romney. The commissioners were in Castle William. The assembly was dissolved. And somewhere in the Atlantic, ships were being readied to carry redcoats to Boston. June 1768 was the last month before the occupation.